Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. So as the war in Ukraine continues, U.S. President Donald Trump claims his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin, is willing to negotiate a peace deal, though there remains tremendous distrust between Russia and Ukraine. Trump, who's also eyeing a minerals deal with Ukraine, made it clear that his administration would not offer Kyiv strong security guarantees, garnering concerns over the country's security. The Kremlin has confirmed that while no immediate talks are planned, Trump and Putin have the ability to communicate at any time if urgent matters arise, suggesting the possibility of renewed dialogue. And within the frame today, we delve into these pressing issues, exploring the broader implications of a U.S. Russia-led ceasefire and its impact on global stability. For this, we connect with Robert Kelly, Professor of International Relations at Busan National University. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you for having me.
And also joining us is Park Won-gun, Professor of North Korea Studies at Ewha Women's University. Great to have you, Professor.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start a discussion with Professor Kelly. Like I've said, the U.S. and Russia are accelerating efforts to end the war in Ukraine with high-level discussions on the way. Before we dig any deeper, could you tell us how big are the chances for a ceasefire and what could the deal likely entail?
I think the chances are actually low because so far the Ukrainians haven't been consulted, and the Ukrainians are one of the combatants in the war. I find it sort of shocking that Trump markets himself as sort of the art of the deal master. You know, he's some great negotiator, but he actually doesn't have one of the major counterparties at the table, right? If the Russians and the Americans reach a deal that involves, I don't know, territorial swaps or something like that, or Ukrainian concessions that the Ukrainian public or government wouldn't accept, it's not clear to me that the Ukrainians will simply stop fighting because Donald Trump threatens them. The Russians, of course, their threats don't matter because they've been invading Ukraine. So I'm not sure that Trump can actually deliver Ukraine, right? I mean, the Ukrainians don't particularly care for Donald Trump right now. We know this. They feel like they're betraying him. The Ukrainians are reaching out to the Europeans. It looks like the Europeans are starting to move. So I'm actually rather skeptical that until Trump gets over his intense dislike for the Ukrainian president and actually brings the Ukrainians into the room, I'm actually quite skeptical that this will stop the war. And as you mentioned, right, I mean, the Russians have said that, any kind of serious talks are still a bit of a way off. So I don't think this is actually leading to an imminent conclusion.
Right, especially with Ukraine not having been taking part in the discussions, right? Now, let's bring in Professor Park into the conversation. So if the U.S. and Russia normalize relations, continue dialogue, resume dialogue, what kind of impact will this have on security dynamics on the Korean Peninsula?
Well, there will be both positive and negative impacts. This will be recorded as first case since 1945, where a nuclear-armed country, Russia, has invaded and seized the territory of non-nuclear state, which is Ukraine. And North Korea's Kim Jong-un may find this highly encouraging, as he himself declared on February 8 last year that most important objective for the North Korea is to occupy South Korean territory using military force in case of emergency. However, at the same time, it seems to me that Kim Jong-un is likely to be deeply concerned about the potential normalization of U.S.-Russian relations. This is a well-known fact. North Korea has placed all its bets on Russia since reviving the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Agreement, the de facto alliance treaty in June last year. North Korea has been supplying troops and weapons to Russia. And Trump's remarks about the wanting to invite Russia back into G8 and his overall accommodating stance toward Russia raise questions about the long-term sustainability of North Korea and Russian ties. The closer the U.S. and Russia become, the more likely Russia will try to distance itself from the North Korea, which persistently calls for the toughest confrontation against the United States. So North Korea has shed blood in an attempt to bind Russia to its side, but Russia may simply walk away, untying itself from the Pyongyang's grip. And another final thing is that Kim Jong-un's dream of forging a new Cold War bloc by uniting North Korea, China, and Russia could drift further out of reach.
Right. So let's circle back to the talks in Ukraine first and go back to North Korea as we speak. But for the talks in Ukraine, President Trump has announced that Ukrainian President Zelensky will visit to the U.S. on February 28 to sign a mineral agreement. And Trump's claimed that the war would end within a few weeks and suggested that the resource extraction agreement is part of the broader ceasefire process. Professor Kelly, how significant is this deal for both countries?
Yeah, it's a little mixed, right? I mean, if you actually read the Kyiv Independent newspaper, probably the best known Ukrainian newspaper in the West, sort of covering the war. Kyiv Independent has gotten a copy of this, and if you actually read the deal, it's all really quite vague. I mean, it's not exactly clear. It's certainly not as rapacious as the one that the Trump people presented a week ago, right? I mean, this whole idea like $500 billion, which would, made sort of which would have indebted Ukraine for 25 years. And that is off the table, right? They're now talking about future revenue based on U.S. investments. But there's no clear arrangement for how that's going to work, who the U.S. companies are, how much stuff the Ukrainians actually have under the ground, right? I mean, have geologists actually gone in there and created any sense of what's underground, right? I mean, I don't know where that $500 billion number came from that Trump threw around for a month. And then, of course, the other problem is that, so if we don't know quite what the Americans and yet what the deal will actually look like on the ground economically, it's also unclear if any kind of security arrangement will come from that, right? I have the feeling that President Zelensky agreed to this as a concession to Donald Trump because Donald Trump has made his distaste for Zelensky so apparent in the last few weeks. It's really, really clear that Trump personally loathes Zelensky. Why is sort of a big question, right? But he really dislikes him, and so I think Zelensky thought that if he signed this deal, which is kind of vague, it'll at least bring Trump around, right? Zelensky's going to get to Washington, D.C. Presumably, he will meet the President Trump, at the time. But, what the Americans are going to get is kind of vague, right? The document's only a few pages, and there's no security guarantees for the Ukrainians either. So, I don't know. It feels to me sort of like PR. I don't know. Maybe Dr. Park thinks something else, but it seems to me it's quite thin in its details.
Right, so it's a very vague situation, but we are still expecting Ukraine to sign the minerals deal, right, Professor Kelly?
Yeah, that's correct. I think they will, and President Zelensky has signaled that. And again, I think it's sort of more a gesture of good faith than it is any kind of a concrete binding commitment on the United States to defend Ukraine, which is something Trump pretty clearly doesn't want to do, right? But and I think because of that, the Ukrainians really hedged and they made it kind of vague about what exactly the Americans are allowed to extract, what exactly the terms of that will be. I mean, we don't know which American companies are going to come in, right? I mean, it's going to be, it's going to be presumably extractive industries corporations, but, it's just really not clear.
Mm-hmm. So with this war still ongoing, Professor Park, how do you think this latest mineral agreement will impact Ukraine's ability to defend himself while simultaneously engaging in diplomatic negotiations?
Yeah, I basically agree with Professor Kelly's and his remarks because we don't know yet at this moment what the exact details of the mineral agreement and how it's proceed further. And I think this is one of the kind of characteristic of a Trump administration he just mentioned, and then there's no details follow yet. But overall, I think from the Ukraine's perspective, the most critical issue is, of course, security guarantee. Well, currently, the United States opposes Ukraine's membership to NATO, and also the United States has no intention to forming any kind of a bilateral alliance or the security guarantee for the Ukraine at all. Instead, discussions are underway about the creating buffer zone between Ukraine and Russia, with the European nations potentially deploying troops. At the same time, the United States insists that this mineral agreement will bolster Ukraine's security. United States Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent stated, quote, "I call it an economic security guarantee. The more U.S. companies have assets on the ground in Ukraine and the greater America's vested interest in Ukraine's economic well-being, the stronger the security for the Ukraine people," end quote. But still, I agree with that. Professor Kelly, we don't know what kind of which company, U.S. company will invest in these things. So we will see.
Right. So economic security guarantee, that would be a term that's well fit for the situation. Now, the latest mineral agreement spurred concerns over Trump's transactional approach to diplomacy. Professor Kelly, if the U.S. prioritizes economic agreements over military alliances, how should South Korea interpret this in the context of its security reliance in the U.S.?
Well, I'm on the record actually being quite skeptical that Donald Trump would intervene on South Korea's behalf in a conflict. I actually wrote an article advocating that South Korea develop nuclear weapons because of this, because I genuinely do not think that Donald Trump will fight a war for any U.S. ally, not just South Korea. I don't think the Article 5 agreement, for example, under NATO really stands. It still exists, but I think it's sort of a procedural formality at this point because Trump doesn't really believe in these kinds of relationships. He just doesn't. I mean, this is a really dramatic reorientation of American foreign policy. And if you follow the European discourse on Ukraine in the last month, I mean, there's a lot of real shock out there. The incoming German chancellor has said we need to start planning for our security without the Americans, which is something no German chancellor has said since literally World War II. And I am genuinely concerned, pardon me, that this applies to South Korea too. I do not believe that Donald Trump would act on the U.S. security guarantee here. And I'm absolutely convinced that Donald Trump would not use nuclear weapons or engage in any kind of nuclear escalation on South Korea's behalf. I think the situation is actually quite at the elite level, not at the mid-level sort of bureaucratic level of like U.S. forces here and the embassy and things like that. I think at the very elite level, the apex level, Trump and the White House, I think the alliance is in bad shape, quite honestly.
So if that holds true, it would be definitely concerning in the part of South Korea. But let's turn into North Korea. North Korea has reportedly deployed up to 3,000 additional troops to Russia between January and February. That's according to South Korea's NIS. Professor Park, what does this suggest about Pyongyang's strategic objectives in supporting Russia's war in Ukraine? And how much longer do you think they could extend such kind of support?
Well, it is not yet 100% confirmed, but there is a possibility. I believe that North Korea has deployed additional troops to Russia. According to the Ukraine's Defense Intelligence Directorate, the first batch of North Korean troops deployed to Kursk battlefield last year numbered around 11,000, with over 4,000 already killed or wounded. Under the conventional military doctrine, when 20 to 30% of the unit's personnel are lost, it is generally considered incapable of continuing the combat operations. So that's why North Korea is likely determined that it was physically impossible to sustain the battle with the initial deployment alone, leading to the decision for second troop dispatch. And it is possible that North Korea and Russia initially agreed to a continuous troops rotation rather than just one-time deployment. And the deployment of the North Korean forces is particularly significant given that Russia is currently focused on the reclaiming as much of Kursk region as possible. Actually, 2 days ago, I had a chance to have the talk with some Ukraine delegation for over more than 2 hours in closed-door discussions, and they confirmed that North Korean troops' presence has affected the situation in Kursk, which is a very negative impact on the Ukraine's security situation. So North Korea is likely to continue to supporting Russia until a ceasefire is reached, seeking compensation in return. And back to your original questions, what Pyongyang wants most from Moscow is a Russian military intervention in the event of the contingency on the Korean Peninsula. North Korea is effectively setting a precedent for such support.
So it wants Russia's backing in case of a potential event that happens in the Korean Peninsula.
Yes, exactly. Mm-hmm. Because you see, Russia and North Korea, both of them the authoritarian countries, so it means that they do not respect any kind of the treaty and principles and norms in the international area.
Right.
So the more important is this kind of precedent. So that's why North Korea sent the troops, and then the casualty more than 4,000. Then in the case of contingency on the Korean Peninsula, North Korea can demand China to send their troops to the Korean Peninsula. This is exactly happened during the Korean War. China got involved in the Korean War because during the Civil War in China, North Korea's the origin of the North Korean nationality had helped to win over the CCP.
Mm-hmm. What about Professor Kelly? Do you agree with this situation? You know, there's some speculation if the war comes to an end with agreements from Washington and Moscow. Some people believe Moscow may distance itself from Pyongyang as it no longer needs North Korea's support and may seek to restore economic ties with South Korea. But others argue that the wartime alliance has evolved more deeper into a strategic partnership. What's your thoughts, Professor Kelly?
Yeah, I think strategic partnership is going a bit too far. This has been a big issue, right? This debate's for like, I don't know, 8 months or so. My sense is that both Russia and North Korea are opportunistic, cynical, transactional in their foreign policy. I think, for example, if the Ukrainians offered the North Koreans, $20,000 per soldier instead of what the Russians are giving them, $2,000 per soldier, the North Koreans might go for that deal. I think the North Koreans are in this basically for the gains they're capturing, that is Russian diplomatic cover at the UN, Russian military, particularly nuclear or missile technology transfers, the payments for the soldiers themselves. I think the KPA, the North Korean soldiers in Ukraine in the conflict, are best understood as mercenaries. I don't actually believe that this is some kind of alignment or new axis or something like that. I mean, again, we don't know, right? I mean, we don't really know what Kim and Putin are saying to one another, but my sense is that both states are extraordinarily cynical. So yeah, to answer, that's a long way of saying yes. If the war ends, my sense is they will probably drift apart. I think if you're North Korea, what you really need if you're North Korea is you really need you need China to be a sympathetic partner, because China has really the wealth to keep North Korea afloat indefinitely. The Russians don't, particularly while Putin is in there, because Putin's going to be sanctioned for a long time, right? As long as Russia is governed by Putin, I think Russia will not be renormalized, shall we say, back into the world economy, right? The Russian economy is not particularly large. It's very, very stressed by all these costs from the war, right? North Korea needs a wealthy sponsor, right? Having the Russians is better than having nothing. And being able to play the Russians against the Chinese is great, right? But ultimately, if you're North Korea, I would argue that you still need China, right? Because Russia just doesn't have as much as the Chinese can offer. And so, yeah, my sense is that the North Koreans and the Russians will probably drift, because the North Koreans don't want to upset the Chinese too much. And we know the Chinese are uncomfortable with the Russians and the North Koreans getting together in the last few years.
Right, so it could be another divide. So as this U.S. pursues a peace deal in Ukraine, there is speculation that Washington could also attempt to manage provocations by North Korea as well. Do you think this could lead to the reopening of dialogue again between Washington and Pyongyang, Professor Kelly?
Yes, I think Donald Trump really wants to meet Kim Jong-un again. I think Donald Trump has a very personalistic understanding of foreign policy. He loves it when authoritarian leaders praise him and flatter him and say he's fantastic. I mean, he loves that stuff, right? And leaders like Xi and Kim are great at this kind of stuff, right? I mean, Putin's a master at manipulating Donald Trump's ego. And Trump doesn't like dealing with democratic leaders, right? Because they push back and they disagree and their publics don't like him and all that kind of stuff. Trump would much, much rather talk to authoritarians. And Trump got a lot of press. He got a lot of publicity the last time around when he spoke to the North Koreans. I think Donald Trump still wants a Nobel Peace Prize. He wants to be understood as a statesman, pardon me. And Donald Trump doesn't particularly care about the U.S.-South Korea alliance. So I think that Donald Trump would be rather comfortable selling out South Korea in order to get a deal with the North Koreans if it got him this Nobel, if it got him the perception that he was this great statesman. I would strongly encourage South Koreans to be very careful in dealing with Donald Trump, right? I mean, if you look at the way he's threatened, like Canada, he talks about absorbing Canada, which has been an American ally since, 90 years, right? I would be very, very cautious in how I handle Donald Trump.
Right. So if the conversation,
if I may, I agree with that Professor Kelly and Trump definitely wanted to win the Nobel Peace Prize, but the place or the event that he can get the more chance to get the reward is not the Korean Peninsula, because he already have experience to do during 2018, 2019, and there is nothing he achieved. So I think that's why he is currently focused on the Russian-Ukraine war or even the Middle East. And I think two places, he has better chance to get the Nobel Peace Prize.
So we are definitely sure that he wants to get the Nobel Peace Prize at this point. But returning back to our topic, so Professor Kelly, could you also remind us of the leverage that Pyongyang has if talks resume with the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest problem, of course, is that the North Koreans are going to play a very, very tough. They will negotiate very, very tough on nuclear weapons. They are building them at a fairly steady clip. We know that they have a fair number of missiles now to put them on top of to put those nuclear weapons on top of, right? And they have been building and building and building, right? I mean, we don't exactly know quite what they have. NIS and CIA throw around all sorts of numbers, but every day that goes by, the North Koreans build their arsenal, right? More missiles, more warheads, and so on. And so those are more and more cards for the North Koreans to play against Donald Trump. I mean, if we are going to get a deal with North Korea that's really going to work, it'll have to be a pretty big deal, right? Which is to say South Korea, Japan, the United States, right? The relevant democratic allies on this question. We are going to have to give up something fairly substantial to the North Koreans. The North Koreans are not just going to sign their nukes away. Remember complete, verifiable, irreversible disarmament? The North Koreans are just going to kind of give up everything because of Donald Trump's New York shtick at Singapore or something. That is just not going to happen, right? We are going to have to give up a lot. It's going to be very, very painful, and there are going to be a lot of constituencies in South Korea and Japan and the U.S. who are going to fight that, because the North Koreans are going to ask for big stuff. They're going to ask for a lot of money. They're going to ask for, membership in the World Bank. They're going to ask for U.S. forces in Korea to be withdrawn. It's going to be a major concession, and I just don't think that stakeholders in the U.S., Japan, and South Korea really get that and have accepted just how much the North Koreans are going to ask for.
Right. So even though dialogue resumes, it would be a very tough negotiation on both sides. Like we've touched upon a while ago, North Korea lately appears to be restoring its relationship with China, as seen in recent diplomatic exchanges and cultural cooperation, of course. Professor Park, what do you think is driving this shift, and what role could China play in shaping the post-war geopolitical landscape?
Well, we will need to observe further to determine whether North Korea and China finally decided to normalize their relationship or not, because for the past 2 years, relations between North Korea and China has been deteriorate. There is a very substantial evidence this for. Now, for instance, last year marked the 70th anniversary of diplomatic relations between North Korea and China, yet no significant event were held to commemorate the occasion. This trend stands in stark contrast to Putin's visit to Pyongyang in June last year. China is engaged in the strategic competition with the United States, which makes maintaining the good relations with the European countries essential. However, North Korea has been fully supporting Russia, we are talking about that, in its war against Ukraine, a war that poses an existential threat to European security. So China has kept to a certain level of distance from North Korea. China will only restore ties with North Korea when the end of the Russian-Ukraine war comes into sight. And another thing is that if Trump formally announced his intention to engage in direct talks with Kim Jong-un, China will immediately re-establish the tie with North Korea. Because in February 2018, we have experience for that. When Trump announced the U.S. North Korea summit, Xi Jinping promptly invited Kim Jong-un to Beijing. So for China, North Korea is either or both of a liability and a strategic asset. China's perception of North Korea shifts depending on the security environment.
Right. So whether this renewed cooperation is driven by economic necessity or strategic alignment, one thing seems to be clear: China's role in shaping the post-war order will be significant. Now, we'll be watching closely to see how this partnership unfolds and what it means for regional and global stability. But as for now, we'll have to wrap up our discussion here. Thank you so much for your insights, Professor Park and Professor Kelly. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Until then, stay informed and engaged.